Good morning. My name is Paul Wirtz, and I'm president of the local chapter of AFCEA. On behalf of the chapter, I'd like to welcome you all to our first annual Homeland Security Conference on Critical Infrastructure. We haven't done a conference in a few years. We decided to hold one in May of 2020, and then COVID happened, and we've had a weird year. We've done Zoom calls and Zoom calls and Zoom calls, and we're going to do one last Zoom call this morning as an introduction, but then we're going to be live all day. Over the course of the last year, we've really seen how important critical infrastructure is. You've seen Texas, Louisiana, Florida, all have incidents where the critical infrastructure failed the citizens or caused problems that were unanticipated. So when we picked the critical infrastructure theme, we did it in 2020, but over the course of the last year, we've seen a number of incidents that are non-traditional, right? So we've seen the solar winds, we've seen the Microsoft, we've seen Colonial Oil just up the street that were, the kind of cyber breaches, but there's other stuff that we've seen that are not the normal infrastructure problems that we've had. So we think that the topic is timely, and over the course of the last year doing these Zoom calls, we've had a lot of problems. We've had new things like, is your mic muted? And then apparently last week I did a little video on LinkedIn about people not being dressed from the waist down. My daughter told me that I triggered her, but she is now in bed doing a Zoom class while she texts her friends, and she's got a little Discord server. So she's living pretty good in this digital world. So when we look at the way things are now and the way things are going, we know that they're not going to be the same, but I cannot tell you how glad I am to have you guys here live in person and doing a networking event. That's what AFCEA is about, and that's the kind of event that we're putting together today. So thank you guys. With that being said, our first speaker for today is Robert Shea, Lieutenant General Robert Shea. He is the president and CEO of AFCEA International, and he's had an interesting year as well. He was the executive vice president of strategic solutions for Smartronix in Hollywood, Maryland. And prior to leaving active duty, Shea served as the Director of Command, Control, Communications, and Computer Systems, C4, for the Joint Staff. He was the principal advisor to the Chairman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on all C4 system matters within the DoD. And with that, General Shea, take it away.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and congratulations to the entire AFCEA leadership team and the membership in Atlanta for putting together what will prove to be a most informative and insightful event, I'm sure. There are few national security topics that are more important than addressing the challenges to our national security and national infrastructure as you're going to talk about today. I think you've put together a tremendous program. So again, congratulations, and I want to extend special thanks to our industry partners and speakers who, without their support, this event wouldn't be possible. So again, thank you very much. What you may not realize is that the AFCEA is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. We're founded following World War II by David Sarnoff of RCA fame, Major General Harry Ingalls, an Army signal officer, and how the Hollywood producer of the movies such as The Longest Day, Daryl Zanuck. And their goal of keeping the dialogue alive between industry, government, and academia that was so crucial in winning World War II continues today. I'd like to give you a little brief background. Paul talked a little bit, but I've been involved with cyber for quite a long time, as well as the critical infrastructure aspect of what goes on there. As the J6, or Director for Command, Control, and Communications for the Pacific Command, back in the late 90s, I was the guy that was the target of the first national military exercise in cyber. It was called Eligible Receiver, and it was eye-watering and eye-opening and a seminal event in my career to think you had things pretty well in control, and then to find out you didn't. I also was the commander of the Marine Corps component to the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense. And as was mentioned, I was the J6 and had the responsibility for writing the first national military strategy on cyber operations. And since retiring, I've sat on Defense Science Board and National Research Council studies on cyber as well. So that's enough of the background, but I just want you to know that, this is something I feel very, very strongly about. Today, I'm not going to touch specifically on the critical infrastructure. I'm going to talk to it in certain parts. I am going to talk about two of the major threats that are out there, Russia and China, and then weave that into the discussion about critical infrastructure as well as cyber as we go through this talk. So let me start with a little vignette. In 9 AD, the Roman proconsul Quintillus Varus, along with 3 legions of Roman troops, about 30,000 men consisting of heavy cavalry and archers, crossed into Germany to bring the recalcitrant barbarian tribes under control. 3 years prior, his legions had decimated a similar uprising and sent thousands of men, women, and children back to Rome as slaves. Varus expected that this outing would be no different. On a hot August morning, the two sides joined battle in the Teutoburger Forest near the city of Minden. Aided by poor weather, using deception and trickery, the Germans lured Varus and his legions into the forest and swamps where they had to break their normal tight formations, and their infantry maneuvers were hamstrung, resulting in their sound defeat. By nightfall, Varus had lost the eagles of 3 legions and was conducting a desperate rearguard action to save his remaining forces. During the withdrawal, Varus could be heard bemoaning under his breath, "Necra, necra," meaning there is no tomorrow. The German barbarian tribes had handed the Romans a crushing defeat. Why? Because Romans' whole operation concept had failed to change and adapt to the new environment in which German tribes challenged them. So the ultimate question for us as a nation is, will we be crying necra as we transition through this world dominated by cyber and information, a relatively new form of confrontation affecting not just our military, but our economy, our geopolitical posture, our values, and the critical infrastructure that underpins so much of what we value? There are a few things, as I said before, that stir my passions more strongly than the topic of cyber and the threat being posed by Russia and the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. So that is where I'm going to put a lot of my focus today, with a couple side excursions. There's little doubt that we're near a great power competition pitting authoritarian governments like China, Russia, Iran, the DPRK, and terrorism versus democratic governments and organizations such as our own. And in this light, the importance of cyber, critical infrastructure, and information operations are taking an increasingly important role. Today's potential for conflict goes well beyond the traditional state-on-state conflict. We're also confronted by terrorists and other adversaries of the like. Cyber is a great equalizer and force multiplier in conflict, and the capacity can be purchased or even leveraged in information campaigns. Russia and China bring a whole of government approach to cyber and the information conflict, and they are less concerned about legal separations and issues that underpin and distinguish democratic societies. With authoritarian regimes, it's easy to coalesce all elements of national power versus the acrimonious debate that can encumber and slow democracy such as our own to action. For the United States to effectively compete, there's got to be a tighter coupling between all elements of national power: economic, industrial, diplomatic, legal, the military, and academia, and like-minded partners. All resources need to be brought to bear in an integrated manner. And this applies to critical infrastructure as well. So along this line, we need to further and better exchange threat data with industry and academia in a timely and relevant and actionable manner. There needs to be more than rhetoric. The overclassification of threat information needs to be re-examined, all the while protecting methods and sources. Incomplete data better serves the interests of national security than the perfect information delivered too late. We need to rapidly adapt and adjust to the new technology-driven environment. Legal frameworks and policy must adapt. Unfortunately, the bureaucracy can be crushing, where speed of action is the coin of the realm. As Bear Bryant said, luck follows speed. If we're not in phase 3 of a cyber information conflict that affects the critical infrastructure, as well as national security, other elements of national security, we're on the precipice, and the national infrastructure is a prime target. Unfortunately, it's not evident to most of the public that we are even in conflict. Even with the recent attack on the Colonial Pipeline and the revelations of solar winds, we become indifferent in many ways to the challenge and even the harmful been even harmfully skeptical about it. The long-term consequences are often not obvious. Where cyber is the battle space, data leading to information and understanding are the crown jewels, and the ability to affect decision-making and speed of action are decisive factors. And the two, skillfully integrated, however, are a force multiplier, perhaps the decisive factor in future conflict. Our competitors are continuously moving the pieces on the strategic chessboard, the cyber chessboard. We need to aggressively retake the initiative, open our minds to new ways of doing business, and invest in the development of new technologies and processes while still being mindful of the old ways and the methods. We must embrace diverse thought to compete. As Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, once said, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. We need to be mindful of that. From where I sit, Russia's strategic goal is to fracture the NATO alliance and the alliances and partnerships we have with other nations who are like-minded towards democracy and freedom as we are. And they want to marginalize our relationships with those countries. They want to undermine democratic ideals. They've been involved across the entire spectrum of war, less nuclear, in the last several years. They're employing many old concepts, reinforced with new tools and methods. They know how to deftly operate in the gray zone using cyber and information to shape the battle space, influence operations and their political agenda, while keeping the West and the United States off balance. A key element for Russia, among others, is sharing and disseminating disinformation and misinformation through social media. With Russian television, the Russian Internet Agency, Russian intelligence, and a host of surrogates contributing to the effort. They are particularly skilled in weaponizing social media. They've learned to leverage modern digital advertising and marketing techniques and integrate them into their practices, as well as investing in and leveraging non-government proxies to mask their efforts. Their focus is to undermine and create seams and weaknesses in the social fabric and democratic norms. China, on the other hand, is seeking to restore China what they view as their rightful place to reign supreme over the old world. Unfortunately for China, the documented record of history does not reflect China's recollection of what history is and what the old world encompassed. Yet their ultimate goal is to supplant American influence in Asia, the Western Pacific, and well beyond. The 2017 Party Congress has solidified Xi's reign and among other things, gave him extended powers to mandate intel collection by Chinese companies, authorize ownership by the government into those companies, among other things. And so China's attempted to shape a new world order through efforts such as their Belt and Road Initiative, engagement in influence operations and intimidation in their own right, particularly in their own neighborhood, ignoring international court rulings such as was delivered by the world courts in the case of their building the artificial islands in the South China Sea. Mis and disinformation have become useful tools. International companies are being intimidated into making concessions to China that they would not ordinarily make to non-authoritarian states, surrendering the rights to intellectual property in order to get an opportunity to compete in the Chinese consumer market. all the while the aggregation of information is a base of power. Chinese theft of intellectual property, defense plans, economic espionage, critical infrastructure plans and designs are pervasive. One only has to look at the physical similarities of the J-31 and the F-35 American fighter, or the J-20 and the F-22. U.S. and Western world are abrogating governance and influence of technical standards bodies, thus giving further advantage to China. That includes standards for the critical infrastructure and the support systems that go along with it. And the same can be said for the continual Chinese pressure to buy and influence access to key technology in Silicon Valley and other tech hotspots around the world to do this for strategic advantage. They're leveraging the international university system, buying access and influence, tracking, monitoring, controlling, advising, and shaping the actions of their students through their Confucian centers. They're making foreign investment in developing countries with challenging predatory loans, often referred to as debt trap diplomacy, where inability to repay loans results in the loss of sovereignty over key infrastructure and resources. Witness what has gone on in Sri Lanka and Djibouti. They are buying influence through lobbying efforts of former public officials and providing personal gain to influence individuals at the expense of their governments, often promoting a culture of corruption, all to gain access to key information such as the design and the controls of our infrastructure. They are slowly buying or shaping their strategic messaging, often in a subtle manner. The Chinese social credit system was designed to provide state control over the population. It's a system designed to ensure the Chinese Communist Party remains in control in light of new technology, exposing the populace to the outside world and the benefits of a free society. They are combining big data, many aspects of artificial intelligence, machine learning, recognition, and surveillance techniques such as biometrics, DNA, geolocation, gait analysis, coupled with aggressive policing to maintain control and influence over the populace. They're gathering comprehensive data on their population and beyond. Look at all the personal information that's been stolen from the United States, tying it to the social credit system. Witness the repressive control over the Uyghurs in the West. More evidence is coming forth every day, questioning the source of COVID and the motives behind the CCP efforts to restrict the flow of information. Internally, China is rapidly moving to the world of George Orwell's 1984, published 70 years ago, where he described the effects of a totalitarian government with strict government control and oppression of its citizens. They recognize that information is power. And so what does that portend to others and the future? And so given this, why would one integrate the information technology infrastructure from a company that is strongly influenced by partnership with such an authoritarian regime? A nation widely recognized for its theft of intellectual property, one that has demonstrated little regard for internationally recognized norms and laws, one that places tight controls and severe penalties over its people, a nation that has the potential to negatively impact privacy and national sovereignty of other countries as it develops its international infrastructure and strategy, reinforcing state control. And I'm referring here to countries that are purchasing Chinese products, including the software, that will potentially give them access to more information than I think we want them to have. Again, what is the business case for a discounted 5G infrastructure, which the Chinese are doing in some cases, when measured against the loss of freedom, the loss of intellectual property, sensitive data, future political influence, and threats to future security? Once they're in your infrastructure, I'm making the assumption that they own the infrastructure in one way or another. One where privacy takes a back seat to the desires of the Chinese Communist Party. A question I posed to NATO and European leaders in Tallinn 2 years ago this month: why would you surrender that to a country that you know does not live by the norms that have been established in a free world? Do leaders really understand the long-term implications and the risk? Unfortunately, we haven't sufficiently demonstrated the political will to address cyber or information confrontation. Western allies are perceived to establish a norm that will not likely respond to attacks. And whether we are or not, it's perception that matters. And the potential ramifications for our partner nations and friends are significant. So I'm going to, related to this is this whole notion of information and information operations and disinformation and misinformation. So information, particularly when it's tightly coupled with the other elements of national power, is a powerful weapon. 280 characters, often targeting useful idiots, reinforcing movement to singular thought. Accordingly, the accumulated power of information and the control in the hands of a few affecting the masses is something that should concern everyone, particularly free societies. Social media, as well as tools to automate the distribution and selective targeting of information, to include the infrastructure, leveraging advances in artificial intelligence and big data, has made it easier to distribute distorted information to select audience, even individuals. Biased information, misinformation, and disinformation are being used to divide the populace into select groups or tribes. Fake news is pervasive. Control of the message is key. So, another interesting question I ask is, for those worried about government eavesdropping, spying, and the affront to civil liberties by government interference, I have a question. Are the social media and technology companies collecting more sensitive info than the National Security Agency? And if they are, to what end? Sharing it to increase their power and influence? What is the impact on democratic society? What are they doing with this accumulated information? Selling it? Using it for political or economic gain? Social stratification? Imagine the power being placed in the hands of a relatively small group of industry leaders outside of duly elected governments. We need to break down the soda straw that many citizens exhibit, looking only at information that supports their personal views and trusted sources, leaving them to be easily swayed by false and misinformation. There's a need to develop programs to help people know how to evaluate the trustworthiness of sources of information, one that requires emphasis on critical thinking. In the battle space of information, the Fourth Estate has failed us. They have in many ways wittingly or unwittingly become the host and purveyor for mis and disinformation. The half-life of the truth continues to shrink. In a 280 character world, where does one go to find the truth? And this kind of reminds me of a story of the Greek philosopher Diogenes roaming the streets of Athens looking for an honest man. Where do we go to find the truth? Unfortunately, the truth is often buried under a mountain of lies where virility trumps veracity. We traditionally think of conflict and war in kinetic terms. One has to wonder if we're heading towards a world where social media and data-intense technology companies become so powerful that they are viewed as the mortal enemies, and how that plays out in the context of cyber conflict, social and political norms, and beyond. As a counter to the threat to our critical infrastructure, there is a need to identify the things that matter most to the adversary and put constant pressure on them as a firm enticement not to interfere with our infrastructure. Some incentives may not be in the cyber domain. I'll leave those up to you to imagine. Our systems and infrastructure need resilience to show that attack and exploitation are not worth the effort. We must raise the bar in this regard. One of the things that we've done over the course of time is we've focused on being more efficient in the way we develop our infrastructure. I would argue that efficiency does not equal effectiveness. And I ask you to look back at what's just happened recently in that regard. So we need to be effective as well as efficient and resilient. I would argue there's a need to review the technical and aptitude standards for key positions in the critical infrastructure workforce across all elements. Are we attracting the right type of people, the right level of diversity? We need to build a set of workforce standards and certifications that approach those required of the men and women in other technical industries, such as the nuclear power industry. There's a lot to be learned from the nuclear power industry and the model that they've developed there. Expensive, yes, but what's the cost not to be successful? And we need our workforce jumping over the training and technical standards bar, not tripping over them when it comes to training and certifications. The structure of governance over the national cyber infrastructure needs a reexamination. There are too many stovepipes. There needs to be a much tighter coupling and integration between DoD efforts, the intelligence community, industry, and academia. So think about this. Imagine what lingers in our networks, unexposed, waiting for the signal to activate. Let me say it again. Imagine what lingers in our networks, unexposed, waiting for the signal to activate. The real threat is what we don't know. One could argue that the adversaries A team and B team are not getting caught. There is a need for a tightly focused national and international leadership that thus far has been slow to emerge. We are buried in bureaucracy, and left to its own devices, the bureaucracy will choose failure over change every time. We can't allow that to happen. The consequences are too severe. Let me leave you with one final thought. It's a thought from Sun Tzu. And I recommend you read Sun Tzu. If you haven't done so, you'll get a good understanding for what's going on in the cyber world from a Chinese perspective. Victorious warriors win first, then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first, then seek to win. Victorious warriors win first, then go to war. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm looking forward to hearing the feedback on how the conference went. So I think you've got a great lineup going forward. Again, I'll turn it over to you, Paul.